Synthetic cubism, it's Apollinaire slash great.
So it's the year where everything exploded, and Proust is part of that 1913 explosion. And of course, immediately after that, the war came, and the modernism was for a number of years forgotten.
But in the
war, and with the return to ethical considerations,
and the recall to order and all of that,
yes,
and that.
But Proust was a classic. Let's say for a number of good readers immediately when he got the Prix Goncourt in 1919. Of course, there was a controversy because this was not a novel about the war. And the prize should have gone to a war novel and not a novel that
of society life, yes.
And the way the war is treated in Le Temps Retrouvé, of course, people didn't know. We're not aware that they would know much later how the war would be treated in Le Temps Retrouvé, but it was not a war novel. But one could also say that Proust was very soon translated. So Proust was recognized as a classic, I would say very early on. And the reaction of the 1930s, which lasted until the 1950s, came because he had gained that status immediately. So the reaction of the novels of the 1930s, Malraux, Céline, reactions of Sartre, and Proust's Rion apotheosis starts only in the early 1950s.
I want to come back to that, but I just thought it's such an enchanting letter. I just thought I would read a little bit quickly. The letter that Proust writes to Gide after Gide writes to him to say essentially, we're sorry, we were wrong not to publish your book. And this is in January of 1914, and Proust writes, I have often found, mon cher Gide, I have often found that certain great joys require our first having been deprived of a lesser joy, which we had the right to expect, and without the expectation of which we could never have known that other joy, the most splendid of all. Had there been no rejection, no repeated rejections by the NRF, I should never have had your letter. And if the words of a book are not entirely mute, if they are, as I believe them to be, like a spectrum that teaches us the inner nature of those remote worlds embodied in the lives of other people, it is impossible for you to read my book and not know me well enough to realize that the joy of receiving your letter infinitely surpasses any I should have had at being published by the NRF. It seems to me it's a compliment, almost oriental in its elaborateness, and obviously poison barbed.
Very ironical.
Yes.
Proust, it is often said that Proust was not a good letter writer because he was a flatterer. He would always go in the direction of his correspondence. But we have a good example of
yes.
a perfect letter.
Yeah, exactly, and whose meaning is perfectly clear. You son of a bitch! That you're coming a little late to the party.
The opposition between Proust and Gide is insurpassable. It's the left bank and the right bank of the Seine. It's the Catholic and the Protestant, and Jewish, of course. But it's everything opposes them. It's the Lycée Condorcet on the right bank and Luxembourg.
The Cavaliers and Roundheads, as they would say in England. But Antoine, I wanted to come back to something you were saying because I think it's profoundly true. That is that almost alone among the great modern masters, we come to Proust for pleasure. People, I'm sure most everyone in this room, starts reading Proust, not, although it may be an assigned text, we generally come to it in the summer. We come to it as something we've been meaning to read, and we've come to a moment and we say, I'm going to read Proust now. That's certainly my experience reading it in English in the first time. What was your first contact as a reader, not as a thinker with Proust?
I read Proust for the first time in 1967, the fall of 1967. When I was in fact studying mathematics. I was in which was the class that's called Math Sup, so you are supposed to do mathematics and only that. But every night I read
super math, right? Yes.
I read Swann's Way every evening for 2 hours or 3 hours, and this saved me from
mathematics.
This is how I survived, in fact. And I remember this, and then I finished the novel, the whole novel, in the summer of 1968. So I was 17, 18 at the time. And I remember it as really, why did I read it? Why did I read it? simply because it was published as a livre de poche, as a paperback. So it gives a sense. I mean, I belong to the baby boom generation. Everything I read because it was published in paperbacks, which we all did at the time. And if you remember the covers of these beautiful Proust books when they were published in 65, 68 in paperbacks, they were beautiful with photographs of the manuscripts and drafts of the Bibliothèque Nationale, which had just bought, the Bibliothèque Nationale bought the Proust manuscripts when the family, Proust's niece, wanted to sell it to the University of Texas at Austin.
Where all manuscripts go to die.
Yes. And at that point, de Gaulle, who was president, decided that it was a national treasure which shouldn't leave for the United States. So they paid a huge fortune so that it would stay at the Bibliothèque Nationale. The check is signed by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was the Minister of Finance at that time. But in any case, the covers were beautiful with these drafts and the handwriting of Proust and photographs, sort of a scrapbook-like. And this was the first reading, and I remember, as a total discovery in the first volume, which had to do with childhood and with memory. And then the second reading was about love and passion and jealousy. A couple of years later.
But I had not known that, Antoine, and it strikes me 67, 68 is the 1913, 1914 of the baby boom generation. That's
absolutely. 1966 is the magical year of that period.
Right.
It's 1966, where everybody published Foucault, Barthes, Deleuze.
And so you're reading it through that, because my own experience was exactly 10 years later. I read it for the first time with my then girlfriend, and now wife, in 1977, and we took it on as what we were going to read the summer before we entered college. And we read it, and I think in Scott Moncrief's wonderful translation, which was still the only available one.
Right. Faithful to it.
Yes, and it's we're talking. It's a uniquely beautiful translation, which entered into English probably more naturally than any translation from a foreign language since Montaigne, maybe in the Elizabethan period. And one of the things that's interesting to me about it is, and there's a wonderful essay that John Updike wrote about his first time reading Proust, which was 10 years before you in 1956 here in New York City, is that for Americans, reading Proust is to enter in some ways an enchanted world. That is, it's the world of Cambrai, it's the world of the Champs-Élysées and the children playing on it, it's the world of twilight and mauve, so that we have, in addition to admiration, a certain kind of cultural longing for what we perceive, however foolishly, as the Belle Epoque, as a golden period in civilization.
But this is the same way Proust was domesticated in the 1950s. As I said, in the 1950s, there's no longer, in the early 1950s, there's no longer any debate about the status of Proust. It means that he enters the school curriculum. And how does he enter manuals? It's through Cambrai. It's through the Bois de Boulogne. It's through these vignettes of the French culture, the French province of the
MGM side of.
In fact, what is troubling is that the first school manual where you find passages of Proust, which is Cambrai and Françoise, is under Vichy, with Proust as a painter of the provinces, as this is what allows him to be, let's say,
because Françoise, the cook and servant,
the cook and the servant, these are the first passages that you find in manuals.
And the book of the two ways and the two paths, with Swann at its center.
Well, there are a number of things that we should say. The first is that the Proust that we read is an artificial Proust. As I said earlier, Proust died in 1922, so this means that the three last titles, La Prisonnière, Albertine Disparue, and Le Temps Retrouvé, are posthumous, which means that they were written by his brother, Robert Proust, and the Gallimard publisher. They could have made a completely different choice. Instead of publishing the 3 last volumes as though they had been finalized and making editorial choices, they could have published them in a much more open-ended way, as drafts, as an unfinished novel.
Work in progress, as we would say.
As a work in progress. In the 1920s, this sort of choice was impossible. As a result, we have 3 final volumes that are made on the model of the first 4 ones. But the novel itself is open-ended, in particular in those 3 final titles, those 3 final sections. Particularly,